I think, Kathy, the only one I've really been involved with to any degree has been Council of Michigan Foundations, and was really introduced to it by my predecessor at the Kalamazoo Community Foundation, Howard Kellaward, because he was there at the time that the council was really formed, and so introduced me to it from day one, and had the pleasure of course, working with Dottie Johnson, subsequently Rob Collier, Russ Mawby, who was one of the key people in founding the council, and others, and had the great fortune of serving on the board and as vice chair at one point, and actually left the board when I became the chair of the leadership team at the Council of Foundations, because I didn't feel I could do both. And that was a time at the national level where time was required. But I also served on the Community Foundation Ventures Board and as chair at one point of that, and the Community Foundation Committee of the Council of Michigan Foundations. And so I had lots of fun working with lots of great people like yourself when you were at the council. 25 years to the day, and I just read something here at the Johnson Center that Dottie was president of the Council of Michigan Foundation for 25 years, and I didn't know that. So it was actually to the day. That was the day I retired. I think there probably is, but when I was first in Kalamazoo, there was no expectation that we were going to play a role outside of the community. We were pretty focused on Kalamazoo, and it was really a stretch for the board, I think, at that point to even go to conferences. That was not something that had been done generally. And when I became the CEO of the Kalamazoo Community Foundation, was the first time we actually had a formal budget. So it was kind of a maturation process within the Community Foundation in Kalamazoo to start to think about the role we might play. And people were kind of surprised at the national level when here this kind of small community had this rather large community foundation on a per capita basis. And in many ways, we were fortunate to be able to play a role at the national level, much like the Grand Rapids Community Foundation with Diana Seeger was nationally. And the board really embraced that and supported me in that role. And even board members became involved nationally when there was a joint Community Foundation United Way committee at the national level, when there were tough times around the Aramoni period, that Betty Upjohn Mason served on that. And then subsequently, our board chair served on, another board member served on some national committees as well. I think in many ways because we had so much to learn. I had so much to learn, as did our staff, about what was going on in other places. I guess, Kathy, I'm not a believer so much that our communities are so unique. People are people, issues are issues. It's probably a matter of scale. And we had so much to learn from other people. And I felt that we were, in some ways, isolated if we just thought about our own community or just about other communities in the state of Michigan. And so I think we learned an awful lot from our colleagues around the country. And so that's somewhat selfish. I remember one day also being asked what I aspired to in terms of leadership nationally, and I said, you know what, I don't know that I aspired to anything. I had fortunately been a small college president and had some modest success in that, and then was in the Community Foundation role, and because of the support of the board, became the CEO there after being mentored by my predecessor. Just wanted to do good work for our community, and that's where our focus was. But I don't know that you can do that without knowing what other models exist. Well, that was one that really the council brought to all of us.
They brought to you, okay,
Mm-hmm.
yep. Mm-hmm.
They brought to us. We were fortunate to be members of the council and part of that whole initiative, I think, at the Community Foundation Committee at that time. And we were fortunate to be able to partner in our community with a wonderful nationally recognized nature center to do some energy work. As I look back on that, that's the only one, I think, where we did not create a permanent endowment. And I was thinking, driving up today, that all the needs around energy conservation that exist today, I wish we had, because that became a driving force for us. Anytime we were involved with an initiative, we created a permanent endowment in our community. I think it was brand new for all of us in the state of Michigan. They fully embraced it. But it was new to them, and it was new to all of us. And I think that, I have to hand it to a great board that they were willing to kind of risk, because they recognized the potential value for the community. And I think that was really the driving force always, was if it's good for the community, then how do we do this? And in our case, Kathy, we did not run any of the programs. I guess I had learned from higher education that with soft money, programs come and go, and if you don't have the resources to maintain them, you really haven't sustained anything that's of value. And so we decided never to run our own programs. We always partnered with somebody else. And that was kind of a philosophy that I and the board, I think, shared together. I'm going back in history, and I don't remember, I don't know that I have everything in the right order, but the Kellogg Foundation was such a great partner in so many ways, and under the leadership of Russ Mawby in particular, such a wonderful, gentle man. Actually, he taught me some things when I was president of a college, to always make sure my door was open. I remember Russ and I meeting in the office one day, and so I learned so much from him along the way. But that's a little background. The Kellogg Foundation was very interested in providing support for youth programs, and with Dottie's leadership, we received really a matching grant from the Kellogg Foundation. We decided in our case to look around the community and say, who should we partner with? Who does it make sense? Who might like to partner with us? And we partnered with the United Way. We kind of provided the leadership on the fundraising for the endowment portion. Donors told us that, in fact, board members told us that if we can raise money with kids, we'll never be turned down. So kids have to be part of it every step of the way, and they were. The United Way became our partner, and today, to this day, they still manage that, and they have the staff component of it, and we provided the endowment component. And perhaps the thing that didn't go maybe as well as I would have liked, I think kids have learned more about the United Way than they have the Community Foundation. But in the long run, kids are learning about philanthropy, and that's important. When early on in my tenure at the Kalamazoo Community Foundation, I had conversations with Dottie about the tax credit concept. And I had experienced the tax credit in higher ed through the independent colleges of Michigan, because they were part of the tax credit. And so we go around the state raising money, and I heard repeatedly CEOs who were interested in private higher education call their chief financial officer into the room and say, "Are you aware of this tax credit?" And frequently they'd say no, and it was very kind of embarrassing to be there when the CEO said, "Well, I should know about this because I can get leverage." I remember saying to Dottie in a memo that we ought to think about the tax credit for every community in the state of Michigan. And I also mentioned the possibility of corporations providing matching funds for their employee gifts. Well, it was about the time that Keller was interested in youth initiatives, and also supported the whole concept of the tax credit at the public policy level. And so that kind of got legs. and became a permanent part of philanthropy in Michigan until recently when we've faced real financial stress in the state. I know I'm going on and on here, but it was about how do we provide permanent capacity and capital in communities all over the state of Michigan that will never go away, and to empower communities to help fill the needs of their community. And it worked, I think, and Kellogg then supported creation of community foundations in every county in the state. So the two went kind of hand in hand. And so every citizen had access to being a donor and also the beneficiary of philanthropy in their community, in their county community. Well, the controversy, I think, Kathy, in some ways, because the original concept was about endowment. The United Way was concerned, and we had multiple meetings with the United Way, and I had been a vice chair of our United Way campaign, and our United Way and the Kalamazoo Community Foundation were formed the same year by the same people in our community. So we had a relationship that was like this. No way did I want, nor did any of our colleagues want to hurt the United Way, because we are partners in our community. One is more of a flow-through to the community. One is a long-term support base for the community. And so as we had meetings with the United Way decided to remain silent on it because of the endowment focus. Now, what I did learn along the way is once it was approved by the legislature, in the writing up of the bill, the word endowment was left out inadvertently by staff. That became a controversy again because I think the United Way felt we had not been honest with them. Again, we had meetings. Again, we expressed that that was our focus all along, was for endowment, and the inadvertent mistake that was made, and that it was it initially passed, as I recall, for 1 year with a renewal needed. So we promised that when we went back, the word endowment would be included. And it was, and ultimately passed a second time, and then the third time permanently with the added components of homeless shelters and food banks.
Why do you think it passed?
Why do I think it got passed?
What were the compelling, you think were the compelling reasons?
Well, we had an interesting situation in Kalamazoo. Mary Brown, who was our state representative, was against it initially. And Mary said, because of our largesse. And we happened to be able to demonstrate to Mary all of the grants and support for people, her constituents, basically, in her segment of the community. And the first time through, she decided then to remain silent and not to oppose it. The second time through, she led the floor fight. I think the reason it passed was because people saw that this benefited their constituents and that anybody could be a donor. I think the biggest issue at the state level was how much is this going to take away from tax revenue for the state? Is it going to hurt? And I'm not sure that we ever had the right kind of research that we were able to demonstrate that it didn't hurt too much. Maybe we know that today, I don't know. And I can probably only respond from my point of view is that lots of conversation about it was not easy to kind of get us all together. My chief financial officer at the time did not want to go with the FIMS product. And I asked her what would be the limitations of going that way, because the benefits I saw was all of us doing it together. And through discussions, the limitations were pretty small. So we decided, even though there were some limitations for us, that the bigger picture long-term was that we would all work together. And I got the feeling along the way was that if we didn't go with the group, it would collapse. And I felt that that was a leadership position that we had to take. And ultimately, the Kalamazoo Community Foundation was very happy with FIMS. I think they're changing today, but lots of has happened to that company along the way. I think the one thing, Kathy, that I never felt we accomplished with that was the potential of statewide data. and actually mining that information for the benefit of the long-term benefit of this state in terms of philanthropy. And that was probably a disappointment for me. Well, at least in terms of the tax credit, and I'll speak to that one in particular, because that one was one I was knee-deep in. One, I'm not sure I ever had thought through how important the coming together and the support from the private foundation, the corporate foundation sector was, that we all stood together. And I want to speak to that a little bit later as well. But that was critical, because those foundations were critical to the passage. They had a credibility that the community foundations did not have at that point in time in the history of our state. Secondly, I didn't realize how long it would take. I thought I knew, but didn't realize we'd have to hire basically a lobbyist or a firm that would help us through, and how the changing waters changed daily in terms of who was supporting it and who wasn't, what the questions were, and so on. The third was, all of a sudden you're in the public eye. And that means that you could be criticized for your work. And it takes just a ton of energy. The long-term benefits, I think, are worth it on so many levels. But you have to be prepared for it. And you need the leadership of, in our case, our association. Dottie was critical to that. She was continually the driving force. But without Russ Mawby and others actually taking their time, testifying in committee on behalf of philanthropy, and community foundations were part of that, it would never have passed. Now, to go a step further, what I think the Council of Michigan Foundations has been so important from day one is that private foundations, corporate giving programs, and community foundations all were part of the founding of it, and all have stood together from day one. That is different, I think, in Michigan than a lot of places. And one day, Randy Reeker asked me at a board meeting when the private foundations were being looked at in terms of their spending policy and their tax on private foundations. She said, and there had been some statements by community foundation leaders in other states like Pennsylvania against private foundations. She asked what our attitude was at a board meeting. And I remember saying that, Randy, we have always stood together, and we are here to support you, like you have always supported us. And Randy smiled. And I thought, that's part of what this Council of Michigan Foundations and our philosophic approach has been over the years. Dottie taught us, Russ taught us, Howard Kellaward taught us. Lots of folks taught us along the way. Well, I think that first, the CEO had such great stature and wanted to make sure that everything got discussed and that there was comfort on everybody's part to make sure that things got approved. And I'm sure people voted in favor at times of things that they didn't feel 100% about. But, there is the art of compromise that we need in the legislative bodies in our state and more nationally today. Dottie worked so effectively with the board and never kept information hidden. It was always out in front of us, and I think that's a great lesson. And she respected everybody on the board. She never pitted us against each other, which is not always the case of a CEO. But Dottie was so comfortable in her own skin and so well respected that we knew that everything was on the table and that we were all going to be focused on the common good. Well, Kathy, when I saw the question originally, I was reminded that when I was a pretty young academic vice president or CEO, a nun at the college where I was president gave me a book by Greenleaf called Servant Leadership. And I've looked back on that and said, Ginny probably knew that I needed to read it. I subsequently gave it to one of my board members at the Kalamazoo Community Foundation, a minister. And he started to use that terminology in his congregation. He subsequently took the book with him to another community. I'm hoping it's doing really well there. But, You know, I think as I've reflected upon it, servant leaders are not about themselves. This is not about your own career. It's not about perhaps the legacy that you provide. It's about the people in the community that you serve. And I think that's one of the most basic elements of it. And that's pretty hard sometimes for young people to grasp as they are trying to develop a career. I don't know if it was where I was in my development or not, but reading that was really important. I think it's about helping people come together. It's not about stepping out and trying to be a leader. It's about serving other people and helping them realize their dreams and their aspirations. And philanthropy, we have lots of resources available, both human capital and financial capital, and it's trying to find a way to help use that capital in ways to support other people in their dreams, not to control it. Yeah, well, again, I point to Russ so much. I never felt like in any conversation with Russ that I was speaking with somebody who was going to control my future. and that's so easy for a private foundation to give you that impression. Because community foundations were, in fact, grant seekers oftentimes. But I never felt that about Russ. He had such a tremendous aspect of his personality and his leadership style that you always felt comfortable and welcomed there, and he was such a good listener. I think it's something for all of us to aspire to be more like him. But it was working together, and I felt that Kellogg, throughout the time I was in the field, or at least most of the time I was in the field, was there to support us in our dreams and aspirations for our communities. And I think Kellogg, because of Russ's leadership and the people he had on his staff, realized that they couldn't be as close to the people as maybe they would want to be, and that we became almost an arm of their founders' desires to support the kinds of things that he was interested in, which were not different than what our communities needed. I think that Russ, at that time at the Kellogg Foundation, quite different than most other private foundations, and even subsequent to Russ's time there. Think that I've used the phrase, felt more like a supplicant in later times. And that was difficult to feel like a partner one moment and a supplicant the next. One challenge was we had a very small board of 5, and we tried to expand it to 7. That was a monumental change in terms of percentage. But the board was really wonderful in doing that and very thoughtful. It's still a 7-member board. I think another time was when a longstanding board member was going off the board, was retiring, and was hoping that his brother might become a board member. And I remember a member of the board saying, I think she had been chair but no longer was, and this gentleman had also been chair and no longer was, said there are no family seats. That was such a powerful statement at the board meeting, and taken so well by this gentleman as well, and by everyone else. But it set a tone for the future leadership and governance of the foundation. I think probably the most difficult time fiscally was when I presented a $1 million budget to the board, and they gulped. I mean, literally, I think they gulped, but we were growing. And the board was just marvelous. Kathy, I had the pleasure, when I came to higher education, I worked with a group of religious women. I had a graduate person who when I was had an assistantship at Ohio University at the graduate level, I worked in a woman's office. The women in my life at the foundation on the board, Martha Parfit and Betty Upjohn, taught me so much. So for me, along the way, the women in my career have been such powerful influences to me personally in terms of my approach to my work. You know, I think there was some question about the number of community foundations, and in some cases, the infringement on other community foundations from a territorial standpoint. Yeah, there were discussions about it. I'm sure there are discussions today about it. That probably hasn't changed some. And there may be a need to bring smaller community foundations under larger umbrellas just from a fiscal and cost-benefit ratio to the community that they serve. Those things probably don't ever fully go away, but my hope is that people always keep their eye on the ball in terms of what's best for our community. I literally recommended to our board when Pete Christ retired that our board have conversations with the Battle Creek Community Foundation about merger. And I said, if I'm in the way, I'll step out of the way. I didn't know at the time that they had already selected Pete's successor. And I don't think any discussions ever occurred. But I really thought, you know, we're a small region. We're 20 minutes apart. Could we do a better job together by shrinking our administrative overhead, basically, and having regional reach? Might happen someday. Who knows? The committees that were formed on CMF were not populated only with the larger community foundations. Everybody was equal. Again, attributed a lot of that to Dottie and you while you were there, and other staff and the board of the council, but also of my colleagues in the community foundation field that recognized it wasn't about how large you were, how much professional history you had in the field. It was about we're all in this together. And that allowed the joint marketing, which had its own issues, which I might mention quickly, is the larger community foundations had to change their name.
After how many years?
Yeah, probably 60 in our case. And there was some feedback that said you will cheapen the name and the concept because you will appear to be more like a community theater, which I didn't understand necessarily would cheapen. It might reflect the community aspect. One of my board members said the word forever is not two words, it's one word. I knew she was an English major in college, and I did look it up and quietly pointed out to her that it could be either way. But there was feeling of let's hold on to the past. But every one of us changed our name for the betterment of the collective group so that we could work together. Dottie again and Rob provided great leadership to us in that regard, and yourself. But it took conversation together and for us to be honest with each other about how hard it was and how could we support each other. So I think that's really important. I think the other thing that was important for me in terms of our work in Kalamazoo was the council's ability to help us build permanent endowments. The tax credit was focused on that. The youth funds were focused on that. I'm going to miss some, obviously. But in every initiative we took subsequent to the Exxon, permanent endowment was created. And because of the variance powers that community foundation boards have, if those endowments were too restrictive, they could be modified to benefit the community. But it produces some permanence. And in a day when there is very little permanence, you know that you have a community foundation with elements that are greatly permanent. I know there's been a lot of discussion in the field of philanthropy of late. Is that the right business model of endowment building? I guess I'm a little old school that believes that without that, I'm not sure community foundations necessarily have a permanent mission for their communities. So I think CMF helped us in that regard, and younger community foundations, other states, other countries that are looking at it ought to think about, is there an element of permanence with flexibility? That is really important to sustainability of this thing we know and call community foundations. My dad worked in the White House for 40 years as a civil servant, from Hoover's administration through Nixon's first term. So I saw my mom, volunteer in the Girl Scouts with my sisters and do a few things around the church, but I honestly don't know if they were philanthropic. But I had an experience as a young kid with a friend in the neighborhood who choked to death one night. And I remember as a small kid saying, I hope someday I'll have enough money to be able to help do something so that this doesn't occur. Now, why I said it back then, I have no idea, Kathy, other than I was probably grieving over my friend's death. I never thought about philanthropy. I guess I didn't volunteer much growing up as a kid. I kind of ended up in higher education because people had pushed me along the way and it encouraged me. I learned how to fundraise, so to speak, in higher ed, and went to foundations for support of my institution of higher ed. I kind of wore blinders. I had enough pigeonholes that I could probably keep a handle on in higher ed. And one day, I had a conversation with Howard Kellaward about the Kalamazoo Community Foundation. He mentioned, and I was there looking for grant support. He mentioned that they were looking for an assistant. And I said, I could tell he was uneasy. He had never had an assistant. I said, oh, Howard, anybody, lots of people would love to work with you, including myself. He called me a few days later and said, did you mean what you said? And I said, you're talking about the grant request? He mentioned the position. I said, gee, I don't know. So I talked to my wife. She beamed because we had 3 teenage sons. So I applied, went through the national search process, and was selected. I took a pay cut. I gave up 3 college tuitions, but allowed us to stay in Kalamazoo, which was a community we'd come to love. And my board chair, vice chair at the college and the nuns said, we don't want you to leave, but if there's any place you're going to go, this would be the best place for you to go. The vice chair was the brother of the chair of the Community Foundation board. So everything was open and above board, which is the only way I like to operate. So I was selected and realized I knew nothing about the Community Foundation. I didn't know anything about all these various funds. I had to learn about the various systems that existed, so I actually would meet with nonprofit folks to teach me about the various systems about disabled youth and what families faced. I ended up buying rental property, partly so I could learn about what low-income people face who have to get housing vouchers and assistance and are homeless. And so I had so much to learn. And I learned from day one the wide variety of issues community foundations are involved in. I used to say that I might wake up in the morning and the first thing on the agenda is we're going to talk about the environment. The next hour might be economic development. The next hour may be homelessness. The next hour may be the arts and humanities. Every moment I was learning something new about the community and the issues facing members of our community and the passion and the love people had to solve issues. But I had so much to learn, and I thought I knew quite a bit in higher education, but I only knew a small sliver. So it was kind of a eye-opening experience, and every day of my life in those 25 years were eye-opening experiences. Andy and I created a donor-advised fund at the Kalamazoo Community Foundation quite a number of years ago now. Portion of our estate will flow into that when we are gone, and it will become unrestricted at the Kalamazoo Community Foundation. And about a year ago, we asked if a portion of it could allow for distributions outside of Kalamazoo County, because we have 3 kids who live outside Kalamazoo County. And last summer, we indicated to each of the families that they had access to a very small amount of money for decision-making by their families for distributions in their community. Now, they haven't done anything yet. And then every once in a while, Andy and I say, they haven't done anything yet. She says, I'll remind them. But we hope, and we see in our kids also volunteerism in a certain way. Whether or not we've done as good a job, Kathy, as we would have liked, but I remember when you spoke in Kalamazoo about families and giving and how important that is. And my hope is that our grandkids, our own kids when they're able. I do have a son who owns a business here in Grand Rapids. It's a fundraising consulting business, and he works with nonprofits on capital campaigns. I know he and his family are quite philanthropic. I really have done almost no consulting in the field at all,
Okay.
which has been kind of a surprise. The consulting I'm doing is with a major, well-established university in St. Louis, Missouri, called Washington University. And I'm currently consulting with 2 real estate development firms, for-profit firms in Kalamazoo. That surprised me. The board, and again, the board was terrific, although I think they're backing away from it today, from what I understand. But the board approved about 15% of the foundation's unrestricted endowment to be used for program-related investments, loans, loan guarantees, et cetera, as one of the tools. And it was after the 2002 decline in the market, when we just didn't have resources. Done an awful lot, which has done a great deal in the rebirth of downtown Kalamazoo in particular. Helped make possible what's called the Southwest Michigan Innovation Center, which is a life science center in Kalamazoo that works up here with the Grand Rapids folks in the life sciences, and did some important things in terms of bringing banks to provide mortgages for low and moderate income individuals by doing a loan guarantee, which took the risk off the back of banks. So did an awful lot. There's still loans out there working. Some of the nonprofits are struggling to pay them back because of 2008. But it's done a great amount of work. We established a fund called a Community and Economic Development Fund. I was really taken aback when the board named it for me when I retired. It's still there, and it's got an endowment component, it's got a grant component, it's got a loan component to it.